Now we have a cherry, what they use underneath.
Tonight, Mary York is going to give a talk about aviation.
Thanks, Karen. And I was thinking about our docents. And with 30 docents, I thought it really unusual that we have 3 commercial airline pilots. Tom Dawes, I saw walk in. Tom's aviation career began with a stint in Vietnam from 1969 to 77. He primarily supplied or resupplied special forces outposts using a de Havilland airplane. After that, he hired on with Chautauqua Airlines, which eventually became part of Continental. Dave's Sanctuary is here, he's in the back. He started out his career way back in 1972, flying MD-80s and 737s for Frontier Airlines, and then took on a variety of positions with Continental. Ended up being a fleet manager and doing some extensive test piloting for 737, 757, and 767. All really big aircraft. And last but not least, we have John Weissart sitting in the front here. Earned his wings in the Marine Corps, credited with saving a number of lives over the course of his career. And, for all of these guys, we thank you very much for your service careers and for your service as docents in the Dawson Center. The pilots that have flown, either that lived here and flew, or nationally known pilots that came here to fly. And you have to think a little bit about why pilots would have come here. Number one is we're kind of centrally located, if you think about between Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Chicago, a number of really large cities. So it was a fairly easy place to get to, both in terms of tourism, so that there was a population here, and in terms of flying. The other thing was the topography of our region. If you were to look at a map, Lake Erie and Lake Ontario are pretty much a barrier to east-west flight. And if you go south, the Allegheny Mountains are there. And you could see that natural corridor coming all the way across the southern tier, which was a fairly easy place to reconnoiter and fly a fairly straight line going from Chicago to New York or New York to Chicago. The other thing is we had a number of popular venues here at Chautauqua Institution, and we also had a lake which had a lot of population of summer tourists that would appreciate things that a pilot might do here. Stunt flying, wing walking, things like that. So much of the early aviation that was done here after ballooning was these very early biplanes, and it was almost like stunt flying exhibitions. As far as previous aviation, we have a huge history, and I excluded it from tonight because it would have made it a little bit too long to go through it all. But I listed there the periods of time that balloons were popular. Started in Jamestown in 1865 with H.H. Kellogg. And if you go back and read those balloons, and they were huge, were taking off right in the middle of Jamestown. The first guy I'd like to talk about is Calvert Perry Rogers. He was born near Pittsburgh in Shadyside in 1879. He had an affinity for racing, be it horses or motorcycles or cars or anything that would get him there a little quicker. And planes would ultimately be his real challenge. That's a great picture of Cal there. He almost every picture I've seen of him, he's sporting a pretty good sized stogie. He was the son of Calvert Perry Rogers Sr., an Army captain who died in the Indian Wars in the Wyoming Territory, the grandnephew of Commodore John Rogers, the great-grandnephew of Commodore Olive Hazard Perry, who battled of Lake Erie, and the grandson of Matthew Calvert Perry, who was credited with opening Japan to the Western world. So he had some real credentials there. His wife was no less famous. She was a Chambers, and the Chambers were the first people to really have extensive glass works in the Pittsburgh area. So he didn't have to fly, he didn't have to do much of anything. He got along in life pretty well. He wanted to join the Navy, but he had gotten scarlet fever as a youth, which rendered him almost totally deaf. And because of that, he couldn't pass his Navy physical. What he could do is go to Orville Wright and say, I want to learn how to fly. And so he took a total of 90 minutes of flight training and became the 49th pilot in the United States. In 1911, he participated in the Chicago International Aviation Meet and won 11,000, and I'm not sure whether that speaks to how good he was or how poor the other guys were, but it enabled him to buy his own aircraft. And with that aircraft, he got to thinking, how can I make more money? So about that time, actually in 1910, William Randolph Hearst of the Hearst Newspaper Corporation wanted to see the population expand westward. So he offered a price of $50,000, which think in terms of what that would be today, for the first person to fly from the west coast to the east coast, or the east coast to the west coast. Had to go through Chicago, that was the only caveat. And he, with two other guys, advanced to take on that challenge. It had to be completed in 30 days, which nobody had flown the route. There were no markers, there were no airports. The planes were archaic by our standards today, so he had a real challenge in front of him. And he knew he'd need a little bit more money, so about that time, Armour had purchased a new carbonated beverage, grape drink, that was called Ben Fizz. And D.H. Davidson, the president of Ben Fizz, said he would pay $20,000 towards the making that flight happen. So this is the part of the 3-car train that Davidson helped him get together. It was the Ben Fizz Special. It was painted bright white because that's the only way Cal could see it on the railroad line and follow it to California. It contained more things than you can imagine. The entourage consisted of Roger's wife Mabel, his wife Maria, Jimmy Dunn, who was his personal chauffeur, his staff, D.H. Davidson, the president of Ben-Fizz, his personal driver, 5 Armor publicity representatives, 2 Erie Railroad representatives, Charlie Taylor, who was Wright's own mechanician, they called him back then, instead of mechanic, and 2 additional mechanicians. All the spare parts for his Wright Model B in 2 automobiles. One is the Palmer Singer here, and you see the sign in the window behind the group assembled there says the Dudley, and for those of you familiar with the area, you may or may not know the Dudley is located in Salamanca. This is a frontal picture of the Ben-Fizz, which was his Model B EX. It was made primarily of spruce with a linen covering and held together with piano wire. I'm not sure I'd trust myself on that. It sported a 35 horse 4-cylinder engine, and that drove 2 props. You can see them in the back. And overall, the plane was 28 feet long and 31 feet wingspan, and weighed about 614 pounds, which gives you an idea of the frailty of that little plane. This is an advertising drawing showing part of the route that Rogers would fly. He took off from Sheepshead Bay, which is near Brooklyn, New York, on 9/17/1911. He went way up the first day to Middleton, and then you see he comes kind of west, going primarily along that route that I talked about, and comes through Jamestown and Lakewood. When he gets out into Chicago, he starts dropping south, because now you're talking cold weather coming along pretty good order, and he's flying about 3,000 to 4,000 feet high enough to stay out of problems and still be able to see the train ahead of him. Eventually he'd arrive at Long Beach, California. That was on 12/10/11, so quite a long flight. A few things that he did not have along on the trip that we take for granted today: pressurized cabin, radar, no radar, instrumentation, no airplane runway, no lights, no landing lights, no co-pilot, and no flight suit. It's cold up there. He had a suit. It was a sheepskin suit, and he typically wore I would call it a suit or a sport coat underneath that. So here he is leaving Sheepshead Bay in September. You can see there's a crowd there to send him off. A number of mishaps along the way, and the one that we focus on here is a crash that occurred in September 24th. It was just a little bit away from Salamanca, a place called Red House. He had problems with gas leaking, and so he landed to see if he could correct that, and on his 3rd attempt to get airborne, crashed into a barbed wire fence, and you can see the damage that he did. It wasn't by far his first crash. They had exhausted many of the parts before they got to Salamanca, so they had to send to Wright and have those parts sent on railroad so that they could replace them. It took 3 days, and that's the period of time he was holed up at the Dudley Motel, enjoying the whatever went on at the Dudley. Unfortunately, that crash kept him from making his planned stop for fuel at Lakewood. And here's a group of guys in a Jamestown Journal picture shown with their gas cans and things for him to eat and that at Lakewood, waiting to receive him. And he never came. He went right on over, circled a couple times, flew over Jamestown, circled a couple times, and went on to Meadville, PA, which was his next stop. This was from the Jamestown Evening Journal reporting on the event. It says, many residents remember seeing Mr. Rogers in that funny contraption, his feet dangling and his hands on the levers at either side of him. School children released for the event raced to what is now the grounds of the General Hospital to pick up papers, which were thrown overboard in bunches. They bore the advertising slogan, "Drink Gin Fizz." So now let's talk about a few mishaps that he had along the way. The flight began September 17th, Long Island. Next morning, Rogers puts free on takeoff at Middleton. Biplane plunges into a chicken coop, grounded for 3 days for repairs. Rogers unhurt. Chickens, not so lucky. In Indiana, he went on to land in a cow pasture. Bull charged him. Rogers waves his jacket to keep the angry bull away from the aircraft. Slips and falls in the cow pies. New Mexico, he landed at Lordsburg, greeted by enthusiastic spectators. Boy takes a cap. A gas tank is a souvenir. Local grocery store owner donates a large potato to replace the stolen gas can. Such was the plight of flying in those days. This is a picture of a stamp that Rogers' wife had commissioned. The stamp cost 25 cents. It did have to carry a federal mail stamp of a penny, and she would pass those out at a stop. The people would buy them and sign them. He'd put them in a bag and then carry them to his next stop, and then they were sent back as proof that they had seen Rogers fly and helped subsidize his flight. In all, Rogers flew 4,231 miles with 71 stops, including, depending on which author you read, between 16 and 39 mishaps. The Vin Fizz had been rebuilt with the equivalent of 4 times, including 28 wings, 20 skids, and 2 propellers. The only original parts remaining at the end of the flight were the rudder, part that steers in the back, a pair of struts, those triangular pieces in the front, and the engine oil pan. That was it. This is his plane in April, about 4 months after he had made the journey. He hit a seagull on the beach and, oddly enough, crashed. And that crash was within several hundred yards of the termination of his original flight. Well, here are some of the outcomes. He did not receive the $50,000. He knew at Chicago that he had had so many mishaps that he wouldn't make the 30 days. And he said he was going to do it anyway. I think it's the spirit of the Perry family. He spent $22,000 to try and make Armour's $20,000 pledge. The curator of the National Air and Space Museum was asked about this plane. But that, if you go down to the Air and Space Museum, it is on display. It's a very accurate rendition of the airplane. None of that plane is original. There's 3 other planes that exist, all of which were parts and pieces that were replaced along the way and built into Ben Fizz models. It's quite something to see. In 1903, the Wright brothers come up with an airplane flying 120 feet. Everybody's joyful. Whole series of different models and types of planes come out. They're doing things like wing walking, dropping out of them or transferring to other planes. Nobody has figured out what to do with an airplane. And along comes a guy, his name was A.J. Engel, and he comes up with a possible answer. Well, he was born in 1879, I think he was in Lakewood, Ohio. Got an idea that he would like to get involved in flying, moves in 1909 to Hammondsport to enroll in the Curtis Airplane School, and moves up through the ranks pretty quickly. By 1911, Curtis puts him on their exhibition team, and he's appointed a flight instructor. He went on later to superintend the production of many of Curtis's airplanes, including the Model T boat, which was commissioned by Rodman Wanamaker of the Philadelphia Wanamaker stores down there. He came to Chautauqua actually in 1910, and he came to the Celeron Amusement Park to perform exhibitions and take people on. He was there in 1910, 1911, 1912, and 13. 1913 he did part-time at Chautauqua and then full-time in 1914. His plane was commissioned the Bumblebee, and it was named the Bumblebee because there was a contest to name it, and 16 girls in the, I think it was the Indiana cottage up in Chautauqua, put in a name, the Bumblebee. All the same, called the Bumblebee from there on in. Pretty good shot of it here. You can see Engel. This is one of the few pictures I've seen without him puffing away on his cigar. He had a lot of notoriety in the various local newspapers, flying around the steamboats, flying people on tours. And that went on for a couple of years. One of the people that he took, this lady here, wasn't the only person that he took up. He took C.E. Welch, he took John W. Packard. People of that age considered themselves enlightened, and it was important for them to be part of anything new and innovative. So he didn't have any problem charging $7.50 to $15, which was a pretty good chunk of change back then, to take people up for a ride at 45 miles an hour on the water and 100 miles an hour quote in the air. I think it was a little slower than that. Again, Jamestown Evening Journal reporter gave readers a glimpse of what that might have been like to be on one of those flights. Writing, until he first leaves the ground and experiences his first flight in an aeroplane, A-E-R-O-P-L-A-N-E, it's absolutely impossible to imagine the delight, the sense of exhilaration that comes from one such a trip. There comes first a surge of freedom. One seems to be freed from all care, and as he feels the rush of air in his face and tears driven from his eyes and down his cheeks by the force of the air as the machine rushes along, the feeling is one of extreme happiness and pleasure. The flyer seems to be detached from all earthly things. Now in 1914, he gets the idea that he's going to have a mail route. Now I got to take you back. 1913, he actually did the first. At the end of his engagement in August, he took one sack of mail, took it from Jamestown, flew it to Chautauqua, and at Mayville dropped it on a port float, and it was picked up by Charles Freeman, who's waiting in his launch for that bag to drop. So that was actually the first mail carrying route on Chautauqua. Then in 1914, he went on to develop that idea a little better, and at the time, the federal people were very interested in the possibility of having air mail to make it faster to get information from one coast to the other. He goes to the Jamestown post office, he gets a bag of mail, goes up on the trolley, takes it to Celeron, puts it on the plane, comes up from Celeron to Lakewood to Bemis to Chautauqua, up to Mayville. He only carried postcards, and they were all produced for his wife. There was a series of 6 of them. Sharon, I only did 4 of the 6 because I'm not entirely believing that the other 2 were pictures of Chautauqua Lake. You can see Engel flying over a couple of sailboats out on the lake, and a picture of him. And these 2, I think the most iconic of them is him flying over the steamboat, which is pretty indicative of the change, what's going on, the technology that's coming about. But there were 6 in all, and today they're worth quite a bit of money to have one of those, especially if it's in good condition. If you think back to the stamp that Rogers had, I think there's 12 of those in the world. They run around 50,000 if you've got some spare change. Any takers on this? 430 in Driftwood. Driftwood Road is south of Bemis, about 2 miles, 3 miles. And the house is up on the hill to your left as you're going towards Jamestown. You picket fence out front. And at one time it belonged to Dr. Alfred Livingston. He was a local physician and had done well. He had a home here during the summer. And he had a daughter by the name of Claire Livingston. Claire was born in 1900 in Jamestown. She went with her brother. Her older brother was a parachutist and got her hooked on flying. Went to an air circus and absolutely loved the thought of flying. Took her first flight at the age of 27 and enrolled in the Curtis Rate School. She obtained pilot's license 200. Now think about how few people had flown. Think about how few people had seen a plane. Only 2% of the United States population had seen a plane at this time. And she, a woman, against all odds, gets pilot's license 200. And then went on, when they come out, get helicopter pilot's license 11. She became a flight instructor with the Army's War Training Service and wing commander of Puerto Rico's National Civil Air Patrol. Her father had amassed enough wealth that he bought a citrus and coconut farm down in Puerto Rico. And after his death, his daughter took it over. It went through in 1928 when a devastating hurricane, and she rebuilt it in concrete. She rebuilt it, she named it Su Casa, and lived there well on into her life. She kept flying back and forth, staying here summers, going down there in the winters. She became good friends with Rachel Miller, granddaughter of Lewis Miller of Chautauqua, and more notably of Amelia Earhart. And she hosted Amelia on Amelia's last flight before she died on her round the world tour. Back at that time, there were 99 women flyers who got together and called themselves the 99s. She became part of the 99s. That group is still in existence today. And they primarily support women in aviation. Ruth Law, the first female aviator was Harriet Quimby, and Ruth Bancroft Law was a protege of her. She bought her first plane from Glenn Curtis. She participated at the Burgess Flying School in 1912, and she was the 6th woman in the United States to receive a pilot's license. Just prior to her attempting the longest flight ever, a gentleman by the name of Carlstrom had tried to fly from California to New York. He didn't quite make it, so she attempted the same flight path in 1916. And she was trying to do it as a non-stop flight. She primarily followed what they called the iron compass, because compasses weren't that available. And the iron compass were railroad tracks. She caught the Erie-Lackawanna, or Erie at the time, railroad tracks near Lakewood and followed them along. She initially was going to stop in Jamestown, but again, did not for a variety of reasons. Went on to try and get as far as she could before sunset. So she got as far as Cornell and was leaking gas, and decided that between the leak and the waning sun that she would put down there for the night and finish the flight to New York City in the morning. But she had covered 661 miles, setting a new record for flying. She had a number of other accomplishments. Broke the existing woman's altitude record of 14,700 feet. Back then, this was quite an altitude record. And it was a record for a lot of reasons, but to me, it was important because they had no protective clothing. She wore a suit and then a very heavy wool suit over that. And on average, if you go up 1,000 feet, you lose about 5 degrees of temperature. That would be her in her flight suit. And again, losing 5.4 degrees for every 1,000 feet she went up. Plus the wind chill, yeah, good point. So I have one other aviator I'd like to talk about. His name was Floyd Carlson. He was self-taught in flying helicopters as helicopters were developed. Went to work for Lawrence Dale Bell, the founder of Bell Aircraft, in 1942 as an experimental test pilot. Made the first tethered flight ever in a helicopter. We call him Bell's Birdman. Bell's Birdman was born in Jamestown, New York. He started out as a daredevil fixed-wing airplane aviator, moved to Buffalo and got a job as an instructor for the Buffalo School of Aviation. He test piloted most of the, in fact I think it was all the Bell helicopters that were developed from 1942 on until his retirement. You say, what did some of these early flights have to do with Chautauqua Lake and this place? In Celeron, there were a lot of stunt flying exhibitions, and at least 3 of those were racing boats with airplanes, and the boats they raced were on a mile course from Eliza Green's Hotel to Celebrant, almost exactly 1 mile. They were raced by John O. Johnson, and they were built in this room. Great history. Hope you enjoyed it.